had been working at Lavinia, an upscale Italian restaurant, for nearly 2 years. The pay wasn't great, but the customers were generous with their tips, most of them at least. I relied on that extra money to get by, paying rent, covering college expenses, and maybe treating myself to a rare indulgence, like a decent cup of coffee from the fancy shop across the street. That night, the place was buzzing with chatter, silverware clinking against porcelain plates, and the soft hum of jazz playing in the background. Everything was running smoothly until he walked in. He was tall, well-dressed, and radiated an aura of arrogance that clashed with the warm ambiance of the restaurant. His tailored suit alone probably cost more than I made in a year. The watch on his wrist? Likely worth more than my car. If my rusty old Toyota could still even be called that. He didn't need a reservation. People like him never did. Instead, he strolled in with an air of entitlement, his sharp blue eyes scanning the room as if determining whether the establishment was even worth his presence. I put on my best professional smile and approached his table. "Good evening, sir. Welcome to Lavinia. May I start you off with a drink?" He barely looked at me. "Scotch? Neat, the best you have." I nodded and hurried away, returning quickly with his drink. He sipped it, smirked, and then turned his gaze toward the tip jar, sitting near the bar. It was nearly half full, a testament to the generosity of the evening's customers. And then it happened. He let out a chuckle. Not just any chuckle, but a deep, mocking laugh that cut through the restaurant's soft ambience like a blade. Conversations around us hushed slightly, heads turning subtly in our direction. "Seriously?" he scoffed, pointing at the tip jar. "People actually give you money like this? Do they pity you or something?" My stomach twisted, but I kept my expression neutral. Years of dealing with difficult customers had trained me well. "I suppose they appreciate good service," I replied evenly. He leaned back in his chair, swirling his scotch. "I mean, look at this," he continued, loud enough for other diners to hear. "They leave their spare change and think they're doing some grand act of charity. And you, what do? Smile and thank them like it's some great blessing." A soft murmur spread through the nearby tables. People were listening, but no one intervened. I clenched my fingers around the notepad in my apron pocket. "I work hard for my tips, sir," I said, forcing my voice to remain steady. "Every dollar counts." He laughed again, shaking his head. "Pathetic," he muttered. "Maybe you should get a real job instead of waiting for scraps." The heat rose to my face, not just from embarrassment, but from anger. I wanted to say something, to fire back, but what could I say? He was a customer. And in my line of work, the customer was always right, wasn't he? I could feel the stares from other patrons, the silent sympathy in their eyes. But no one spoke up. No one ever did. That's when he walked in, a towering figure, effortlessly commanding the attention of the room. A familiar presence, a legend, Shaquille O'Neal. And in that moment, I had no idea that everything was about to change. Just as I was swallowing back my frustration, trying to compose myself, the atmosphere in the restaurant shifted. A subtle but undeniable change, like the moment before a thunderstorm when the air feels electric. And then, he walked in. Shaquille O'Neal. Now, I'm not the kind of person who gets starstruck easily, but when a 7 feet 1 inch basketball legend enters the room, you feel it. It wasn't just his size that made heads turn. It was his presence. He carried himself with a confidence that wasn't arrogant but warm, inviting, larger than life in the best way possible. Conversations dimmed as people noticed him. A few diners whispered excitedly. A couple of younger customers discreetly pulled out their phones. And even the chef peeked from the kitchen. But Shaq? He acted as if he was just another customer, flashing that familiar, easygoing smile as he made his way to a table near the center of the restaurant. I took a deep breath, trying to shake off the sting of the rich man's words, and approached Shaq's table. "Good evening, sir," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. "Welcome to Lavinia. Can I get you started with a drink?" Shaq grinned. "What's good here, my friend?" His tone was genuine, friendly, the complete opposite of the last guy I had just served. "Well, we've got some great house-made lemonade, or if you're in the mood for something stronger, our signature old-fashioned is pretty popular." Shaq rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "Man, you know what? I'll take both. Some lemonade to start, then hit me with that old-fashioned later." I chuckled. Good choice. As I turned to walk away, Shaq's eyes flickered toward the tip jar on the counter. At first, I thought nothing of it, until I saw his brows slightly furrow, his expression shifting just a little, and then his gaze landed on the rich man. The man was still lounging in his seat, swirling his expensive scotch, a smug smirk still lingering on his lips. He hadn't acknowledged Shaq's entrance at all. If anything, he seemed more interested in watching me squirm. I had barely made it 3 steps when Shaq called out, "Hey, hold up." I turned back. Shaq leaned forward, resting his massive arms on the table, and nodded toward the rich man. "What's going on over there?" For a second, I didn't know how to answer. I couldn't just blurt out that a rude customer had mocked my livelihood. What was I supposed to say? The rich man, noticing Shaq's attention, finally glanced up. His expression flickered, ever so briefly, with recognition. He knew who Shaquille O'Neal was. Of course he did. But instead of being impressed, his smirk widened, as if he found something amusing. "Oh, nothing," he said lazily. "I was just educating our fine server here on the reality of working for tips." Shaq didn't smile. "Is that right?" he said, his voice still light, but carrying an unmistakable edge. The rich man leaned back, unfazed. "I was just saying how ridiculous it is that people toss in their pocket change and act like they're doing a good deed. And worse, servers act like it's some kind of grand blessing." He shook his head and laughed. "Honestly, it's pathetic." A few gasps rippled through the nearby tables. Even the bartender, who had been polishing a glass, froze mid-motion. Shaq's expression darkened, not in anger, but in disbelief. He let out a small chuckle, shaking his head. "Man, I've heard a lot of nonsense in my life, but that's got to be up there." The rich man raised a brow. "Oh? And why's that?" Shaq sat up straighter, his massive frame making him seem even more imposing. "Let me ask you something," he said. "You ever work a job where you had to rely on tips?" The rich man scoffed. "Of course not." Shaq nodded slowly, as if that was all he needed to hear. "Yeah," I figured. For the first time, the rich man's smirk wavered, just a little. Shaq turned back to me. "You got my lemonade coming, right?" I snapped out of my daze. Yes, sir. Right away." He grinned. "Cool. And while you're at it..." Before I could react, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a thick wad of cash. Without hesitation, he peeled off several $100 bills and walked right over to the tip jar. With a slow, deliberate motion, he dropped them in. The sound of crisp bills hitting the jar's bottom was louder than it should have been. The entire restaurant had gone silent. Shaq turned back to the rich man, clapped a hand on his shoulder, and said in a voice filled with humor but undeniable weight, "Now that's how you tip." The rich man's face reddened. He opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. I stared, my heart pounding. The entire room had just witnessed something extraordinary. And I had a feeling this was just the beginning. The silence in the restaurant stretched for what felt like forever. Every eye was locked on Shaq and the rich man, whose once smug expression had now twisted into something else. Discomfort, embarrassment, anger, maybe a mix of all three. I was still processing what had just happened. Shaquille O'Neal had not only publicly shut down the man's arrogance, but had also tipped more than I made in an entire week, maybe even 2. The rich man let out a dry chuckle, trying to regain his composure. "Well," he said, shifting in his chair, "that's generous. But honestly, Shaq, I don't see the point. These people are just—" Shaq held up a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. "These people?" Shaq repeated, raising an eyebrow. "You mean hard-working people? People busting their butts every day to make an honest living? That who you're talking about?" The rich man hesitated. "I just mean, it's not exactly a career, is it? Serving tables. It's temporary. Something people do until they find something better." I clenched my fists. There it was again, that condescending attitude, that belief that people like me were somehow less because we worked for tips. Shaq exhaled, shaking his head. "Man, you really don't get it, do you?" The rich man crossed his arms. "Enlighten me." Shaq leaned forward, resting his massive forearms on the table. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried a weight that made everyone listen. "Let me tell you something," he began. "I've played in packed arenas. I've won championships. I've made more money than I ever thought possible. But you want to know what I still remember? The days before all that." He pointed toward me. "I remember being in their shoes." The rich man scoffed. "Oh, come on, you were always destined for greatness. You're Shaquille O'Neal." Shaq smirked. "Nah, man. Before I was Shaq, I was just a kid trying to help my mom put food on the table. I worked jobs people like you would probably laugh at. I bagged groceries. I mopped floors. I even worked security at a club for a while." The rich man frowned, but didn't interrupt. "You think serving tables ain't a real job?" Shaq continued. "Try walking in their shoes for a day. Try dealing with rude customers, long hours, aching feet. Try smiling when you're dead tired, because if you don't, your tips suffer. Try balancing this job with school, bills, family responsibilities." He gestured around the restaurant. "You look around, and you see people you think are beneath you. I look around, and I see grit, hustle, determination." The rich man's jaw tightened. He wasn't laughing anymore. Shaq wasn't done. "You ever heard of respect?" The question hung in the air. The rich man opened his mouth, then closed it. Finally he muttered, "Of course." Shaq nodded. "Good. Then maybe show some." Another silence. But this time it felt different. Heavier. The rich man wasn't smirking anymore. Instead, he stared at his untouched drink, his fingers drumming on the table. I glanced at the tip jar. Shaq's generous tips sat there, untouched, a silent testament to the lesson he was trying to teach. And then, something unexpected happened. The rich man reached into his wallet. For a moment, I thought he was going to throw in a few petty bills, just to save face. But instead, He pulled out a thick stack of cash, probably $1,000 or more, and silently placed it into the tip jar. A ripple of shock spread through the restaurant. Shaq leaned back, arms crossed. Now, was that so hard? The rich man exhaled sharply, then looked at me for the first time with something that almost resembled humility. I was wrong, he admitted, though the words seemed to physically pain him. I never really thought about what it's like, the effort it takes. I didn't know what to say. Instead, I just nodded. Shaq smiled, giving me a wink. That's the thing about life, man. Sometimes, you just need the right lesson to open your eyes. The rich man didn't reply. Instead, he pulled his coat over his shoulders, stood up, and without another word, walked out of the restaurant. As soon as the door swung shut behind him, a soft applause broke out from the other diners. It wasn't loud or dramatic, just a quiet acknowledgement of what had just taken place. Shaq picked up his lemonade, took a slow sip, then grinned. Man, that hit the spot. I let out a small laugh, shaking my head. You really didn't have to do all that, he shrugged. Sure I did. People like that? He gestured toward the door. They walk around thinking money makes them better than others. Sometimes they just need a little perspective. I smiled. For the first time that night, I felt truly seen. As I walked back to the bar, my tip jar now filled with more money than I'd ever seen in one shift, I realized something. Shaq hadn't just given me a big tip. He had given me something far more valuable, a lesson in self-worth. And I would never forget it. The restaurant slowly returned to its usual rhythm, but the energy in the air was different. It was as if something had shifted, not just for me, but for everyone who had witnessed what happened. I glanced at the tip jar again, still struggling to process the reality of it. The stack of cash the rich man had left sat there, mingling with Shaq's generous tip. It felt surreal. Shaq was still sitting at his table, casually sipping his lemonade like he hadn't just changed someone's entire perspective on life. He caught my eye and grinned. You good? He asked. I nodded, a slow smile forming. Better than good, he laughed. Good. Now don't go spending all that in one place. I chuckled, shaking my head. I don't even know what to do with it yet. But deep down, I did. This money wasn't just cash. It was a symbol, a reminder that my work, my effort, it all mattered. A surprising return. About a week later, something unexpected happened. It was a quiet afternoon shift, and I was refilling salt shakers when the restaurant door swung open. I looked up and froze. It was him, the rich man. But this time, he looked different. Gone was the expensive suit. He was still well-dressed, but the air of arrogance had faded. He hesitated near the entrance, almost like he wasn't sure if he should be here. I took a deep breath and walked over. Welcome back, he exhaled, nodding. Hey, I don't know if you remember me. I raised an eyebrow. Oh, I remember. He gave a sheepish smile. Yeah, I figured. There was a pause. He seemed to be searching for the right words. I just wanted to say, I've been thinking about what happened that night, about what Shaq said, and I realized he was right. I never really understood how hard people like you work. I took a lot for granted. I studied his face, searching for sarcasm or insincerity, but there was none. That's why I'm here, he continued. I wanted to apologize, and, well, I wanted to do something about it. I frowned slightly. Do something, he cleared his throat. I own a few businesses, restaurants actually. And I started thinking, if I expect my employees to work hard, I should at least understand what they go through, right? I nodded, unsure where this was going. So, I decided to work a shift at one of my own restaurants, just to see what it's really like. My eyebrows shot up. You what? He laughed. Yeah, I figured if Shaq thought I needed perspective, maybe he was right. I crossed my arms, intrigued. And? How'd that go? His smile faded slightly. It was eye-opening. I was exhausted by the end. My feet were killing me. And the worst part, customers treated me like I was invisible, or worse, like I was beneath them. I let that sink in. For the first time, he had felt what it was like to be on the other side. I get it now, he admitted. I used to think success made me better than other people. But the truth is, I wouldn't be successful without hardworking people like you. And I never even realized it. He looked me in the eye. So, I just wanted to say, I'm sorry. And thank you. For a long moment, I just stared at him. This was the same man who had mocked my tip jar, the same man who had looked at me like I was nothing. And yet here he was, humbled, changed. Finally, I smiled. Apology accepted. He let out a breath of relief. Thanks. That means a lot. A ripple effect. As the weeks passed, word spread about what had happened that night. Customers who had been there told the story to their friends. Some even started tipping better, realizing how much service workers depend on it. And Shaq? He came back a few times. Every time he did, he left another generous tip and reminded me, never let anyone make you feel small. Your work matters. But the biggest surprise? The rich man followed through on his change. He adjusted wages at his restaurants, making sure employees earned better pay. He set up a scholarship fund for workers trying to go back to school, and every time he dined out, he left huge tips. Not because he had to, but because he had learned the value of respect. The final lesson. One night, I was closing up the restaurant when I noticed something sitting on my station. It was a card. Curious, I picked it up and flipped it open. Inside, written in neat, careful handwriting, was a short message. Thank you for teaching me a lesson I'll never forget. No signature, just that. I smiled. Because in the end, this wasn't just about tips, money, or status. It was about something far greater. Empathy, understanding, change. And sometimes, the most unexpected people are the ones who need the biggest lesson.